How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another tier list video. This is the first one we're doing since the banning of Winota joiner Forces and Expressive iteration. Obviously, that had a pretty big impact on the format. Given that the bans took out a S tier deck and several top tier decks, I think we're expecting, at least for this week, and that's sort of what we've seen, for the meta to shift back to what it was before Winota started sort of taking over again. So this will probably be the last week where we don't see much innovation. Hopefully we see some changes next week. Otherwise, we're going to be sort of back in a very stagnant metagame. But for now, this week, we had three major events to look at. We had the normal challenge on Saturday. We had the mock showcase challenge on Sunday and the NRG 5K paper trial also on Sunday. So this was another bigger week as far as results go for Pioneer. Let's dive right in. Starting with the FNM tier, these are the decks that will show up well enough at your local FNM. Wouldn't recommend them pretty much anywhere else, especially with PPTQ season coming up soon. These are decks to avoid. First up, we have Blue-Black Control, sort of the perennial second or third best control deck in the format. Shows up often in the hands of the French top control players in Guillaume Magnon and Wafatapa, but outside of them, rarely shows up at the top tables. Next up, we have Blue-Red Creativity. There's 2 or 3 different builds that are starting to show up, including one by Aspiring Spike, but I think they're still a little bit away from being contenders. Next up, we have Blue-Red Prowess, sort of trying to run with the deck after the ban of Expressive iteration. I think of the decks that were hit by Expressive, Prowess is probably the biggest, and unfortunately it is going to be a struggle to replace one of the best cards in Magic. Next up, we have Rakdos Sacrifice, another continued victim of the representation of Karn in the metagame. I think if Mono Green were to find another predator in the way that it did Winota, Rakdos Sacrifice becomes a more reasonable contender. But until then, unfortunately, the deck is not in a great place. Jund Citadel similarly doesn't get to use its final big win condition in the Karn matchups, and kind of a little bit slower than you'd like to be. I think a lot of the Jund decks in general are a step slower than the meta calls for right now. Next up, we have 4-color Fires, another deck that can go over the top, but again, with the presence of control being able to interact favorably with you and Mono Green Karn, there are still decks that go even further over the top of you. I'm just not a big Agent of Treachery fan right now. Next up, we have Mono Green Stompy, sort of a throwback to the old Mono Green aggro Vivian Arcbow Ranger decks of the past. I think you're just the worst Mono Green deck, and again, I think this deck can show up, but I'm not expecting it to do too much in the overall metagame. Next up, we move to D tier. These are, again, decks that have a little bit more basis than FNM tier. They can show up, maybe even steal a win out of nowhere in some of these challenges, as one of these decks did. But on the whole, week to week, I would not expect them to perform to the level that I would want to bring them to these kind of events. First up, we have 5-color Humans, which we've been seeing a couple different builds. There's been a Pyre of Heroes build that was present in the D-Gen event that I won last week. Really, actually, I thought a very interesting take on the deck, being able to pivot to being a little bit more interactive through your selective choices of what cards to get with Pyre. But overall, I think Humans is still a step too slow for an aggro deck, not controlling enough for a prison deck, and it's just a piece or two short of being a really strong deck. Next up, we have Boros Heroic. This is a deck that sort of flashed in the pan with the release of Streets of New Capenna. I think people have pretty easily adjusted to this deck. Any amount of removal is tough for this deck to beat, even though you can interact with things like God's Willing to avoid it. I think right now, Heroic is just not fast enough to get under the mid-range decks and not resilient enough to deal with the various control and removal decks. Last up in D tier, we have a Tarka Ramp. This deck has won 2 challenges now. I think it's an interesting deck, but I think its biggest problem is that it's a 2015 style ramp deck in 2022. You have virtually no card advantage or selection. All of your cards sort of just come off the top, and if you are able to find the right combination of early ramp and threats, you can often run over your opponent, but you don't really have any way to mitigate just the number of lands and air you run, with 8 ramp spells in the 3-mana slot, your 4 Arboreal Grazers, your 10-ish top end threats. If you're not able to find your threats on time, often you just sort of look like a big ramp deck that doesn't do anything. So I think this is the throwback of a ramp style deck that has kind of been pushed out through more modern style ramp decks like the Mono Green Karn deck. But we've seen it start to succeed. If it continues to show up, it'll keep rising in the ranks, but I haven't been impressed with it as of yet. But I know some people were making some updates and some changes, and those looked promising. Next, we're going to jump up to the S tier like we've been doing recently. We started at the bottom, now we're going to jump to the top because the top sort of influences everything below it. So S tier, 1 deck, shouldn't be a surprise. Mono Green Karn putting up 14 top results this weekend. Honestly, with the banning of Winota and the addition of Skylasher into the sideboard, it feels like Mono Green Karn has very few truly bad matchups left in the metagame. I would say this is 1 week away from being sort of in that S+, like we should probably consider a ban situation. The deck is incredibly consistent and powerful, and overall, Winota was the big thing keeping it down. We had seen with the rise of Winota, Karn had dropped and dropped and dropped, but without Winota, we're going to need to see a new deck sort of put some restraints on Mono Green, or it's just going to be a oppressive representative of the metagame. Next up, we have A tier. These are your next best odds to win the event. Again, they're very likely to top 8, potentially win the event, and I think a lot of times they have good matchups into a lot of the decks below them, but might struggle in this case into Mono Green Karn, which I think is exactly the case. So first up, we have blue-white control, and I'm combining blue-white control and Esper control here. Blue-white control, I think, has a horrible matchup into Mono Green, but is in a very good position in the overall metagame outside of green. What Esper control gets, and here we're looking at the energy top 8 with Zach Atten's list, is that you get a much better green matchup, but you lose some points against the general field. And so I think it's a balancing act of, if we see an egregious amount of green, I would rather be playing Esper. If we see a variety of decks, I'd rather be playing blue-white. I think it's very tough to make the blue-white matchup palatable for blue-white into Mono Green, but if you run into basically anything else, you feel comfortable in the blue-white spot. So I think blue-white and Esper are sort of in that spot where you need to metagame what you expect to face, but I think they're very powerful into the overall meta, with the exception of Mono Green Karn for blue-white. Next up, we have Rakdos midrange. Again, I think as we see a bunch of creature-based aggro matchups rise up, which you'll see in B and C tier, Rakdos midrange, great interaction early on the board, planeswalkers to be able to contest blue-white control and Esper control. I think it's an underdog against those control decks, but it's close enough to be palatable for sure. Where again, you struggle is the Rakdos midrange is not a good matchup into Mono Green Karn. So if Karn remains a heavy player in the metagame, both of these A tier decks suffer from that, while being able to pick off most of the other decks that are trying to attack Mono Green Karn. I think right now, much like when Winota was dominating a couple weeks ago, it sort of breaks down into you either attack the best deck, or you attack the decks trying to attack the best deck. These A tier decks are attacking the decks going after green more so than going after the best deck. Next up, we have B tier, and kind of a surprise, but we've seen Blue-Red Phoenix rebound from the Expressive Iteration ban, winning the NRG 5K, and I think the addition of Crackling Drake is really smart. It gives you a good way to fly over the top of some of the ground-based decks in the metagame, and also gives you a way to plop down a big threat and then leverage Disdainful Stroke, Aether Gust, etc., to keep mono green off its tempo, and then you just have a big flyer to kill them quickly. That's what we saw in game 3 of the NRG final. I think Blue-Red Phoenix, obviously, you can't replace a card like Expressive Iteration, but you can get it to a point where it's still good and solid, and I think people have been making those adjustments, and I actually really like where Phoenix sits in an attempt to attack the control decks, the Rakdos midrange. And with Crackling Drake, I think you have a much better game against Mono Green Karn post board than you did before. Next up, we have Mono Blue Spirits, which usually when Mono Green Karn is the top deck, Spirits starts moving up as it's a natural predator to decks that have cards with 4 or 5 CMC or mana value as an average. But with the finding of Skylasher, I feel like Mono Blue Spirits loses a little bit of its edge. Also, Phoenix didn't go away in the way that people expect it might have with Expressive Iteration. Red Black midrange is still around. These are both very tough matchups for Spirits. And while Spirits wants to be attacking a deck like Blue Eye Control, Esper Control, and Mono Green Karn, I think you have enough other matchups that are able to handle Mono Blue Spirits that you'll find that it's tough to hit enough Mono Green or hit enough Blue Eye Control to make these top 8s reliably. I think Mono Blue Spirits is probably the best tempo deck in the format, but I'm just not sure if it's good enough right now to handle all the decks other than the top deck. Next up, we have C tier, and these are sort of the decks that I feel like will spike here or there, have a subsection of good matchups, but their overall place in the metagame is generally a little weaker than I would prefer for some of these big events. A lot of the times, these are decks that might have 1 or 2 really bad matchups, and if those are prevalent, that's a big reason they don't move up. So first up, we have Nivtale. I think this deck continues to show up week after week as a top mid-range contender. I think you get to go way over the top of decks like Rakdos midrange. You have good ways to handle things like Lotus Field, etc. with your Slaughter Games. I think Slaughter Games actually gives you a reasonable shot against Mono Green Karn. I just think there are a lot of situations where the Mono Green Karn deck is fine playing into you, but I think it's a closer matchup than it might seem on paper just based on being able to reload your hand. And if you're able to interact with the key cards from green, you can sometimes go over the top of them, but on average, green is still going to get under you more times than not. I think Niv is in a great position to beat up on some of the decks looking to go after Karn, but you still have some decks like Mono Blue Spirits that are not going to be very fun for Niv to be playing into. Next up, we have Mono Red, which as time has gone on, I feel like originally I was much more split on how the matchup into Mono Green looked. It's a lot more play draw dependent, how the hands line up. The more that I've played it, the more I feel like Mono Green Karn is just slightly favored, with the exception of some hands player draw. And I think with Rakdos midrange continuing to be a top deck and Blue Red Phoenix showing up again, Mono Red starts to have some more natural predators, along with not being as good into Mono Green as may have been originally thought. Next up, we have Lotus Field, which continues to sort of show up here or there, but the biggest problem is that you are looking to take advantage of a high amount of control, things like Blue Eye Control, Esper Control, Blue Red Phoenix, but Mono Red, Bant Spirits, Mono Blue Spirits, and Mono Green Karn are all matchups you don't want to face, and the deck just runs into too many of those in a given tournament. Last up, we have Bant Spirits, sort of able to leverage its position into Blue Eye Control and have a little bit of a better matchup into things like Rakdos midrange or Blue Red Phoenix than Mono Blue Spirits does, but I still think these are tough matchups, and Mono Green Karn can still just get through Banned Spirits. I think Mono Blue Spirits is much tougher for Karn. Banned Spirits, you're relying on things like Spell Queller and Coco to sort of take advantage of the game, and those aren't as impressive into Mono Green Karn as just hard counter spells for Mono Blue. So I think in the current metagame, I would much rather be playing Mono Blue Spirits, and it's hard for me to rank things that are very similar to other builds or other archetypes, but aren't the best in that archetype above C tier. So that's the tier list for this week. The big headline is Mono Green Karn back with the banning of Winota. I'm keeping a strong eye to see how it goes going into this weekend. If we see another really impressive weekend out of Mono Green, again, it made the finals of every major event this weekend. I think we have to have a discussion about Nykthos or Storm the Festival. But hopefully we see some adjustment now that people know the bannings have put Karn back on top of the metagame. But again, if we don't see that change, it's a bit of a problem for the overall metagame of Pioneer. And again, there's always a top deck, but the level in which Karn is dominating right now is a little bit beyond that just best deck category, at least for me. So, with that being said, thanks for watching, everybody. See you next week. Hey there. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you've enjoyed this content on either Twitch or YouTube. If you did, please like or subscribe. If you didn't, be sure to leave a comment down below. I promise not to read it. Until next time.